All right, we've got a real head-scratcher for you today, something straight out of the world of high-stakes corporate finance. Imagine this. A company owes a ton of money, millions in fact. The due date comes and goes, not a penny is paid. Seems like a clear case of default, right? Well, what if I told you that legally it wasn't a debt at all? We're about to unpack how a tiny detail in the fine print didn't just win a court case. It turned the whole definition of debt on its head. Let's get into it.
So, here it is, the big mystery we're tackling. You've got a company that owes more than 37 crore rupees. The deadline passes, the money is nowhere to be seen, and yet a court says, nope, no default here. How on earth is that possible? Well, the answer, as you're about to see, is hidden deep in the language of contracts and the very strict letter of the law. Okay, let's start with the creditor, a company called REC Ltd. Now, from their point of view, this whole thing was a no-brainer. It was an open and shut case. They were owed a huge amount of money, and they simply weren't getting paid. So this timeline looks pretty standard, right? Back in 2019, a deal is signed for something called Redeemable Preference Shares. Now, you can think of these as a kind of hybrid investment. It's part ownership, part loan, and it comes with a promise that the company will buy them back on a specific date. Fast forward 2 years to that date, and nothing. The parent company, RIP, doesn't pay up, so REC does exactly what you'd expect. They start sending out demand notices. To them, the clock had clearly run out. And listen, we are not talking about a small sum here. The total amount they were after, once you factored in dividends and interest, was over 37 crore rupees. That's the kind of number that gets everyone's attention. Lawyers, courts, you name it. It's a massive amount of money that REC fully believed was theirs. So REC's logic was crystal clear. There was a date on the calendar, that date passed. The money was not in their bank. In the world of finance, that is the literal textbook definition of a default. So they were convinced this was a slam-dunk case to start insolvency proceedings against the company's subsidiary, PPDL. But as you know, there's always another side to the coin. Let's flip over and look at the debtor, PPDL, because their defense, well, it throws a massive wrench in the works and completely changes the story. And this slide really nails the central conflict. On one side, you have REC saying, hey, a promise was broken, the money is due. But on the other side, PPDL is basically saying, hold on, the conditions were never met to even start the payment process. They argue that a whole bunch of legal boxes had to be ticked before that money could even be considered due and payable. And this right here was the smoking gun for their entire defense. This little clause in the agreement. PPDL's lawyers zoomed in on those two words, only if. They argued that this creates a condition. The right to get the money from them only kicked in if the preference shares weren't redeemed. But here's the clever part. They then asked, but what if those shares could never have been legally redeemed in the first place? All right, so this is where the National Company Law Tribunal has to step in and sort this whole mess out. The judge had to untangle this incredibly complex knot of contracts and laws to figure out who was right. Let's break down exactly how they did it. The tribunal's decision really boils down to 3 core pillars. First, the nitty-gritty details of the contract itself. Second, the super strict rules laid out in India's Companies Act. And third, they looked back at what the Supreme Court had already said on the matter. Let's dig into each one. And this slide, this is the law at the very heart of the case, Section 55 of the Companies Act, and it is incredibly specific. Think of it like this. There are only 2 keys that can unlock the money box to pay back these shares. Key number 1 is using company profits. Key number 2 is raising new money by issuing new shares. If you don't have one of those 2 keys, that box legally stays locked. So you can probably see where this is going. When the tribunal looked for the keys, they found nothing. There was absolutely no proof that the parent company, RIPL, had any profits available or had issued any new shares. And if the legal conditions to unlock the money weren't met, well, then the company was legally forbidden from paying REC, even if it wanted to. And this quote from the judge, man, this gets right to the core of it. The tribunal, with the backing of the Supreme Court, basically said this: holding a preference share makes you an owner of the company, not a lender to the company. The money you put in is share capital. It's equity. It is not a loan. So a failure to buy back that equity is not the same as defaulting on a debt. Legally, they're in 2 completely different universes. So, a judge made a ruling. Why should you care? Well, this decision isn't just some dusty legal footnote. It has huge real-world consequences for how investors, lenders, and companies all need to think about structuring their financial deals. So when the dust finally settled, here's how it all shook out. REC's attempt to force insolvency? Thrown out. PPDL? They managed to dodge a bullet that could have ended the company. But you could argue the real winner here was the law itself. The court drew a bright, unmistakable line in the sand between being an owner, which is equity, and being a lender, which is debt.
So what are the big lessons here for investors and lenders? First and foremost, preference shares are not debt. Legally, they're a form of ownership. Second, that due date written in a contract isn't set in stone if the law itself gets in the way. The Companies Act can actually trump whatever your contract says. And all this leads to the most critical point. To start an insolvency case, a debt can't just be unpaid, it has to be legally due and payable. And as we saw here, that is a much, much higher bar to clear.
Which leaves us with this one massive question at the end of it all. Is this ruling a fair shield, protecting companies from being pushed into bankruptcy over payments they are legally blocked from making? Or is it a dangerous loophole for investors who might think they have a secure investment with a clear payback date, only to find out they're left holding an empty bag with no options? It's a really fine line, and this case shows just how critical it is for everyone in the financial world to know exactly which side of that line they're standing on.